Madam President, I'm joined on the floor today by my friend and colleague, Senator Graham. We have the honor of co-leading the U.S. congressional delegation to the Munich Security Conference, which for a great number of reasons, all well-deserved, is still called Codell McCain. It is the only Codell that is named for a senator who is no longer with us, and it is in respect for Senator McCain's long tradition of support for that conference, NATO, and the Atlantic Alliance more generally. This year, obviously things were very different. The Russians were on the border of Ukraine, and two things came out of this conference that I thought were important. One was an early flicker of hope within the delegation that the Ukrainians might actually pull this off. That was supported by none of our briefings. The entire national security establishment has presumed that it was only a matter of time until Ukraine fell. But Senator Graham and I and others were questioning each other during that trip. Is there really no chance? And the other thing was going after the kleptocrats and the oligarchs around Putin and making their lives miserable. And there was just a wonderful explosion of bipartisan support for that is now manifested in funds, in laws, in pending bills, in lots of bipartisanship. And Senator Graham and I are going to have a bit of a colloquy about that with the chair's permission.
Without objection.
I'll say one thing and then I'll hand it over to Senator Graham. On March 8th, I sent out over social media this sentiment. Keep alive in your heart the possibility that Ukraine could actually win. Columns stalled, defense fierce, casualties high, morale low, deserters surrendering, food and fuel snafu, population uncowed. Since then, we're hearing more and more. I'll read 4 quotes, and the first is from the man we heard from this morning, the President of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky, who in his speech to the people of Ukraine on March 14th didn't just talk about peace for Ukraine, although he did talk about peace for Ukraine, but he also talked about our victory. Victory. It's an important word to keep in mind. He's not alone. General Wesley Clark on CNN, also on March 14th, said the battle for Ukraine is hanging in the balance. If we can get enough in there, they'll push the Russians out. Victory. To continue his quote, it will be a tremendous win for the West. Ann Applebaum knows probably as much about this area as anyone. She joined us on the Munich security delegation, and she also spoke afterwards on the 15th of March about, and I'll quote her here, victory in this conflict. Victory. She said, victory would provide an enormous transformational boost in confidence to the entire democratic world. Michael Kaufman, the director of Russian Studies at the Center for Naval Analyses, has said the same thing. Are the Ukrainians in a position to win the war? Yes, he said. And I'll close with Francis Fukuyama, on the 10th of March, the author of The Origin of Political Order, who said the following things. I'm quoting from a much longer piece selectively. 1, Russia is headed for outright defeat in Ukraine. Victory. 2, the collapse of their position could be sudden and catastrophic, rather than happening slowly through a war of attrition. The army in the field will reach a point where it can neither be supplied nor withdrawn, and morale will vaporize. 5, the Biden administration's decisions not to declare a no-fly zone or help transfer Polish MiGs were both good ones. They've kept their heads during a very emotional time. It is much better to have the Ukrainians defeat the Russians on their own, depriving Moscow of the excuse that NATO attacked them. And finally, a Russian defeat, he said, will make possible a new birth of freedom. and get us out of our funk about the declining state of global democracy, the spirit of 1989 will live on thanks to brave Ukrainians. We are here together on the floor in bipartisan fashion to urge that in the press coverage and in our national security conversations about this, we keep open in our hearts and in our planning the possibility of victory for Ukraine. Senator Graham.
Well, thank you. All I can say is, Sheldon, thank you. John's no longer with us, but I think he's here in spirit at this moment. If Senator McCain were here, it'd be 27 MiGs they'd want to transfer because he'd probably be in one headed toward Ukraine. The bottom line is, 20 days into this fight, we're all amazed at how bad the Russians are doing and how well the Ukrainians are doing. And I think what Senator Whitehouse is trying to remind us all of, that the outcome in Ukraine really does matter to the world writ large. Senator McCain was known for his support of the Transatlantic Alliance, a rules-based society, a values-based world, and Putin's put that in jeopardy. So let's look at it this way. If Putin wins, Sheldon, then the largest war criminal in the 21st century survives the dismemberment of a neighboring democracy, slaughter of the innocents on a mass scale. If he's still standing, I think China understands what to do with Taiwan more clearly. The Iranians are more bold when it comes to their nuclear ambitions, and the ripple effect in Asia and the Mideast will be felt if Putin wins. Now, if Putin loses and the Ukraine wins, victory for Ukraine, I think it'd be the biggest change for the good since World War II. What would it mean? It would mean that a murderous war criminal who tried to use force of arms to impose his will on his neighbor lost. It would mean that the good guys won and the bad guys lost, and China would have to think twice about Taiwan. And how do we make sure victory for Ukraine is maximized? Only God knows how this ends. But here's what I think we can do working together. 3 lines of effort. Economic and military aid. We've had a very robust package leave the Congress. The President announced $800 million of more military aid today. We have a difference about the MiGs, but otherwise we're pretty much on the same sheet of music. Sanctions against Russia. The war is not against the Russian people. They're in many ways a victim of Putin as much as anybody, but unfortunately, the only way we can bring this to conclusion and have victory for Ukraine is to crush the Russian economy. So secondary sanctions needs to be on the table, and if China comes to Putin's aid, they need to understand the consequences of that decision. So all in on sanctions. Secondary sanctions are now in play. The Ukrainian ambassador asked me yesterday to broaden the sanctions to Russian officials in different regions that are part of Putin's war machine. President Zelensky asked for that today too. So my good friend Sheldon Whitehouse has been speaking about victory when nobody else hardly would. And I'm here to say that victory for Ukraine is victory for America, is victory for the rule of law, is victory for the post-World War II order that has led to historic prosperity. 3 lines of efforts: military assistance, including MiGs, economic aid, fuel, food, humanitarian airlift, if that's feasible, crushing sanctions, and labeling Putin the war criminal he is, and letting every Russian military commander know that if you pick his side and you carry out these war crimes against the Ukrainian people, we're coming after you. So Senator Whitehouse and myself met with the British Foreign Secretary and Ambassador to create a joint effort, an intel cell, to collect information about Russian units engaged in war crimes in Ukraine, start putting the commander's name out for the world to understand. So they'll know that we're watching them. How does this end? The Russian people end the reign of terror of Putin. It's in their hands. I encourage them to do it. And finally, if there's been one voice on kleptocracy It is Sheldon's. He's got it on climate change. He's determined to see that issue through to the end. But Senator Whitehouse was talking about kleptocracy long before the invasion. So we're going to introduce together Asset Seizure for Ukraine Reconstruction Act, which is an effort by our government, joining with international partners, to get every yacht we can get, to raid every bank account we can find, take the money away from the thieves and give it back to the Ukrainian people and eventually the Russian people. So what Senator Whitehouse and I are trying to do in a bipartisan fashion is to make the war real to the oligarchs. Without the oligarchs, there's no Putin. It's time for them to enjoy an experience of having their assets that they stole taken away from them. Maybe not enjoy is the right word. It's time for us to enjoy the sight of Russian oligarchs having their property taken that they achieved through thievery. It's time for us to start putting people in jail who engaged in the mass theft of the Russian people. And victory for Ukraine is not only possible, I think if we're all in on sanctions, we're all in on labeling, naming, shaming people around Putin as war criminals to break their will, and we begin to pour it on when it comes to regaining control of the skies. I'm not for a NATO no-fly zone because I think that would put us in a situation with NATO and Russia that I'm not comfortable with right now. But I am for Ukraine controlling their skies, a no-fly zone enforced by the Ukrainian military. That's why I want more anti-aircraft systems and the MiGs. The bottom line here is that victory for Ukraine is possible because I think the Russian people and the Russian military are really not into this. I think the world is coalescing around the idea that if Putin wins, it's bad for us all. And now's the time. This is the most historically significant moment since the end of World War II for the continent of Europe and for freedom itself and for the rule of law. If we can pull this off, then those who come after us will be very pleased with our efforts. If we fail, future generations will wonder, what the hell were you doing? Just like we all wonder how Hitler could have gotten so strong and nobody stopped him when they could. So let it be said that this moment in history, that Senator Whitehouse, Senator Graham, and many others, particularly the Ukrainian people, believe not only is victory for Ukraine possible, it's absolutely necessary. With that, I turn it back over to my colleague.
Madam President, just in conclusion, let me thank Senator Graham. He's been an extraordinary leader on the Munich security delegation year after year, and I think has a McCainian view of our foreign policy needs. I would close by saying if there's a lesson from Ukraine, it's that oligarchs can throw out a dictator if you put pressure on them. So the kleptocracy initiative is important strategically in Ukraine, and it also puts in motion forces that can diminish kleptocracy and corruption around the world in a way that enhances our rule of law and national security. The press has tended to buy into the narrative of defeat, but not entirely. Sudarshan Raghavan went to the front for the Washington Post. And he reported back this: to be sure, most military analysts and Western officials still predict that Russian forces will eventually encircle Kiev and push into the capital, possibly aided by airstrikes. While this could prove true, he said, it's far from clear whether Russia will prevail. That leaves open the important planning option of victory for Ukraine. And then when bad news comes, sometimes it's just not the whole story. The BBC reported the bad news that Russian forces are already inside the city of Irpin. Well, there's a little bit more to the story than that. A Ukrainian army officer said that Ukrainian forces were waiting for civilians to evacuate Irpin before, to quote him, "we start to clear the city of Russians." They don't have enough provisions, food, water, he said. They don't have a lot of gasoline. They will get tired, and then we will go and drive them out. Well, it appears that that counteroffensive is underway right now as we speak. And as I close, I think all of our hearts and prayers go to the Ukrainian troops trying to drive those Russians out of Irpin and out of Ukraine. I yield the floor.